For this last session of the third day of the Future of the American Child Journalism Fellowship, we're going to be talking about the issue of child labor. I'm sure that all of us have seen the stories lately about various policies and moves by state and federal government about child labor, whether we're protecting children from being exploited or not. And I thought it would be important for journalists to hear from a top-level expert about what we need to know about the policies, about what's happening at the state level and nationally, to help us in our coverage and possibly to go back to our communities and look around and see if there is a story there. So we're very fortunate to have Jennifer Sherer join us today. She is the Senior State Policy Coordinator for the Economic Policy Institute, and she's prepared a presentation for us today. So Jennifer, please join us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here and excited to meet all of you. So I have just a quick welcome first. I wanted to say hello on behalf of my Economic Policy Institute colleagues. I know that a lot of you talk to folks at EPI, and if you haven't talked to folks at EPI, all of them said to make sure to invite you to do so. We work on obviously economic policy, but we really specialize in the conditions of working class, low and middle income people, jobs and employment, wages and labor standards, unions and collective bargaining, and race and ethnicity in relation to economic conditions. So EPI.org is our website. Anything that I show you from either the report I'm going to talk about on child labor today or any of our other publications are all available there, along with a lot of other information. I also wanted to mention that we have a presence around the country. So no matter where you're from, there's a high likelihood that we have a state or local group that is affiliated with Economic Policy Institute through what we call our EARN network, Economic Analysis and Research Network. And I work specifically with a team of folks who focus on state policy and coordinate work with those state groups around the country. You can check out, there is an interactive map on our EARN website too, where you can see which groups those are in your state. And sometimes those are really good resources at the state level for media as well. And of course, our website is full of data tools of all kinds. Some of the, one of the things that I know people in the public use very frequently are things like our family budget calculator, which lets people type in their zip code, their county, their address, and generates estimates of how much it costs to live based on different metrics that you can put in. We have all kinds of cool things like that. I also want to start with a caveat that I am not one of our economists who create all these fantastic data tools. My background is in labor. I was a labor educator for about 20 years, and I actually started part of my career working specifically on a project focused on child labor, which is the topic that we're going to delve into today. And I've worked on worker rights and policy issues for a couple decades now. And I think, like a lot of folks in the US right now, I have found myself saying this year, wow, I didn't expect 20 years after starting my career working on a project that was really focused on global child labor standards and the potential for US consumers to try to influence improvements in other countries, to be now refocusing on domestic child labor and the reality that we are seeing very significant upticks in child labor violations, including in hazardous occupations. Before I start, I want to do a couple things, and I also want to throw a couple questions out to all of you. So child labor is a topic that touches on a lot of other subjects inevitably. It is connected inevitably to immigration policy. It is historically connected to racism. We know that children have built the US economy in every period of our history. I'll talk about that in a second. And covering this issue is a really significant challenge because almost everybody, let's say almost everybody has some experience with work, and those experiences range across a huge spectrum. And of course, everybody has an experience of childhood, and those experiences range across a huge spectrum. And people have very deep, in some cases, emotional and also ideological attachments to both how they define their relationships to work and also their relationships to their own childhood or their children's childhood. So we're going to be diving into some policy questions, but I always want to step back before we dive in and recognize that we're going to be touching on a whole range of important issues as we step into this. And the other reality, and I feel like I've encountered this in many of my discussions with reporters over the last couple months on this issue, is that everybody has a first job story. And covering this issue and interviewing, policymakers and folks in the public on this issue will often trigger this dialogue, which can range from nostalgia to, in some cases, traumatic experiences. I wanted to, have a chance to pose a question to you as we're getting started. Did any of you have first job stories? Yeah, go ahead.
My first job story, I sometimes joke that my mother would probably be called into Child Protective Services, but she had worked in a factory when she was in school. So she heartily encouraged me to work in a factory. So my first job at 15 years old was an overnight shift in a green bean canning factory, including hazmat suits. It was the best experience I ever had, and that now when I cover stories, I learned a lot about working in a factory, but it was beyond the hardest. It was 10 and 12 hour shifts.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It was pretty intense.
And if we had time, I would ask everybody a follow-up question, which is what I can hear, even in the one sentence version of your story, there were positive things about it. Maybe there were not so positive things about it, right? And so the question even of what are young people learning as they enter workplaces is completely wrapped up in the policy debates that we're having right now. Anybody else have one that they wanted to toss out right off the bat?
When I was 14, I started singing in my father's band professionally and had to get special licenses from the Liquor Authority of New York State.
Uh-huh.
And then sometimes I bussed tables in restaurants on the weekends. So I started working right away when I was 14 as well.
Okay.
My 17-year-old has not yet worked, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing both of those. And also raising one of the very specific questions that is being raised in some of the state policy debates right now, which is jobs that require teens to be in the presence of others drinking alcohol or to be serving alcohol, right? That's absolutely one of the very specific things that's being debated. So everybody has sometimes multiple stories, and it is important, I often think, to take that into account and also then step back and think about the wide range of work experiences that people have, and the values attachments that we're trying to bring to policy debates especially when we're talking about children and the workplace. What is it that makes a certain work environment acceptable or unacceptable for children to be in? We're here today talking about this because it's not a settled question. It has never been a truly settled question at the federal or the state level. And so the other thing that I've learned from years of having discussions with folks on this topic is that there is no way to answer these questions without some specifics. As a labor educator, we used to, when we had time, sometimes run through extensive scenarios to let people think through what is it that makes particular working environments acceptable or unacceptable. And I have the spectrum up here because I find it a really helpful tool to apply. And I'm going to give you just a couple scenarios just so we can, so that I can get a sense of, and give you a sense of some of the realities of what we're often what policymakers are trying to think through right, so I'll give you one first, and we'll just let you have 3 seconds at your table to see if you come to consensus with where you think you'd put it on this spectrum from a 0 to 10. So giving you a little bit more information about a particular situation. A 13-year-old girl takes out the trash, washes dishes each night, mows the lawn once a week in the summer, and receives a $10 a week allowance if all the chores are completed. In her own home. Where would you want to put that on the spectrum? So one table came up with 8 or 9 toward the end. Any other tables have different numbers that you settled on? Okay, also an 8. Okay, an 8. So we're kind of in this, sounds like, general area. Any reason it didn't rise to the level of 10 for anybody? Okay, the lawnmower sounded potentially hazardous. Is potentially hazardous, right? Yeah, okay. Let me give you a second one. A 10-year-old girl from a poor family in the countryside is sent to live with an unfamiliar family about 50 miles from home. After school each day, she's responsible for watching 3 younger children, washing dishes, washing and ironing laundry, cleaning the kitchen and bathrooms. She is provided room and board, but no additional pay. And I can hear that folks even in the discussion are raising, well, what are other, what are factors we don't know about that might be, you have some information, but not everything we might want to know. But any quick reaction? A 1?
She's 10 and she's left in charge of younger children. That's problematic. The long hours. Now, some might say, well, if she doesn't have anywhere else to live or living conditions at home are horrible, maybe it's better. But overall, to me, that's exploitive.
Yeah. Sounded like folks were landing down on this end for that one. Okay. And that last scenario really encapsulates, that was my grandmother, right? Other thing I should say by way of introduction is that I work for EPI remotely. I still live in Iowa. I've been there for about 20 years. And we are having a very robust debate about child labor regulation in our state. And one thing I found myself often reminding folks is we are less than 2 generations away from very exploitative forms of child labor that people remember in their family history, know well in their family history, and maybe need to remind ourselves in some cases of what the impacts and the consequences in some cases of that may have been. I'm going to give you just 2 more quickly. I'll give them to you together so that we can compare and contrast, because I think they represent another couple of common scenarios that, oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, thanks. I just want to understand, when we're talking about child labor, I didn't even realize it kind of extended to inter-family decisions about what children did or
So
didn't
the
do.
reality is that the question of what kind of work children do or cannot do, it impinges directly on who decides, family, state. It's actually erupting into many of the state legislative debates now, which we'll come back to, so I'm glad you're asking this. The questions I'm asking you right now are purely, what are the value judgments that any of us might attach to situations that we think about a young person being in? So, whether any of these situations are legal or not under current frameworks would be a different question. Yeah. But it is true that historically we have typically in the US embedded in our laws exceptions for both work in the home and work in a family business. Those are treated differently under our laws. In many cases, probably for good reason, but of course it also, in some cases, opens the door to hazardous situations. I'm gonna give you 2 more. One is a 16-year-old boy works at a fast food restaurant after school for about 5 to 7 hours per night, 4 days a week, is paid $4.25 per hour, usually gets off at 10 o'clock, sometimes is scheduled to work until midnight, and then closes the restaurant and cleans for about an hour afterwards. So that's number 1. Number 2 is A 15-year-old works at a theater selling tickets and concessions from 5 to 8 p.m. 4 nights a week and is paid minimum wage of $7.25 an hour.
The first example would only be legal under federal law for the first 90 days.
Right. So there's a provision in federal law that allows employers to pay below minimum wage for the first 90 days. That
For minors.
yeah, for minors. Yeah.
Training.
But really, my question to you right now is, does it sound acceptable? No. Yeah. And any other quick reactions to the second one, the theater?
I mean,
Closer to the other end of the spectrum?
$7.25 an hour, I guess, for a teen. And if it's 4 nights a week, and again, if he's not doing the midnight shift or she's not doing the midnight shift, you know, if I come pick him or her up at 10 o'clock, to me, I don't know. I come from a perspective of my first job was one of those federal, you know, grant job programs that was tightly controlled, and you know, I forget the name of it, but you know, I was never, as a girl, never allowed to work late night hours and do things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so those hours matter, right? The number of hours, the time of the hours. The point here, I mean, we could do a lot of other scenarios and delve into the details, and also then begin asking ourselves the right question, which you're starting to ask, which is, what parts of this are legal or not legal under our existing laws? But really the point is that the details matter. This is an issue where the details truly matter. And so I wanted to start that way, just to step back and remind ourselves that there are 1,000 different scenarios in which children are working, sometimes in the same occupation, and one may be way up at the end of the spectrum and one may be on the other end for various reasons. It may have to do with the pay, it may have to do with the timing, it may have to do with the number of hours they're scheduled, it may have to do with the way they're treated. All right, so I want to transition and begin diving more into the policy debates that we're seeing erupt all over the country right now, and start really just by acknowledging how much I appreciate journalists and the incredible journalism that has been happening on this issue for the last few months. In particular, I'm guessing that a lot of folks may be familiar with the New York Times coverage that Hannah Dreier has been leading, which has really opened lots of people's eyes to the reality that hazardous and exploitative forms of child labor have never been eradicated in the U.S. The coverage that she's been doing has been important for reminding folks of that. I think the way in which it's linked to the report that we put out a couple months ago is that this uptick that we're seeing, this is a measure of just the cases that the Federal Department of Labor has identified as violations by year. The light blue line are portions of those violations that include infractions of what are called hazardous occupation orders. So there are a lot of different ways to violate child labor law, but these are the portions where there's a significant health and safety concern involved. That uptick is dramatic, right, over the last few years. And it's not just an uptick, it's also an increase in the seriousness or the type of violations that we're seeing. And we decided to do a complete report, which EPI I don't think had done on child labor, maybe ever, this year, when we began to notice and track that state legislation was cropping up repeatedly, in some cases in what appeared to be a really patterned manner. So at the same time we're seeing increases in violations, what many of us, I think, would expect, or maybe even should expect, is that federal and or state policymakers might be stepping in to say, how do we start to reverse that trend line? And maybe we have some loopholes that we need to close. And instead, what we're seeing is a really clear, fairly coordinated effort to weaken state level standards. And I'll talk about, I think, some clarity we have at this point about where that push is coming from. Our report, when we issued it a couple months ago, we had documented 10 different states. I think we've since identified at least 16. But because some additional legislation was filed since the report came out, and also because I think there were one or two from last year that we didn't catch the first time around. So this is an emerging and really accelerating trend, I think it's fair to say. This year, 2 of those bills have already been passed through both houses of the legislature. One in Arkansas, which has been signed by Governor Sanders, which focused on eliminating the permitting requirements for 14 and 15-year-olds, which historically has been a state responsibility. It's not something that's required under federal law. It is something that state agencies have often done in order to better monitor and protect, especially the youngest teens who are going to work, and create a paper trail, which is an important thing to have if you're going to actively enforce the law. Iowa has passed and is on its way to the governor's desk. She hasn't signed it yet, but has indicated she's intending to sign it. A very long and complicated bill that changes over 24 different provisions of the state law. So everything from changes in the hours that teens starting at age 14 can work, to a long list of hazardous occupations that employers may now assign them, including many that contradict existing federal standards. So these are just some of the, sort of the headlines. So thinking about where this is coming from, we're going to go back and then come forward again. As I mentioned, the US has been built on many forms of child labor: enslaved children, indentured children, children of poor families. The photos on the left may be somewhat familiar to folks because during the Progressive era, journalists and photographers in particular played a really key role in beginning to advocate for child labor regulation, especially on the state level at first. You can see that those are photographs of white children, which is also significant because historically, of course, Black and brown children have been far more likely to be employed in exploitative or hazardous conditions. But it is also the case that much of the advocacy success in beginning to regulate child labor comes about when massive numbers of poor white children were employed, and concern began to grow around their conditions. And child labor remains commonplace in US agriculture. And I'm raising the racial disparity here because that has been literally built into our employment law system since the early part of the 20th century. So regulation of child labor, along with our first federal laws that instituted a minimum wage and overtime provision, so that's the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, as well as our labor law, which in 1935 was the first time the federal government said that workers have a protected right to organize a union without retaliation from their employer. Those laws cover the vast majority of private sector employers, but they do not cover certain occupations. And the occupations they don't cover came about as carve-outs or exclusions simply because of racism, because Northern too, for that matter, but because congressmen at the time refused to pass those laws into effect if they were going to cover Black and brown farm workers and domestic workers. So to this day, those occupations are not covered. That also means that child labor in agriculture is regulated very differently. And I continue to hope to draw more journalists' interest and attention to that, because rather than weakening the standards that we have, which are fairly weak to begin with, we really have a long way to go in ending that two-tier system that has been with us since the 1930s. And before we get to the 1930s, which is the first time the federal government finally put some basic labor standards into place. It was states that were beginning to set some guardrails around the types of work, the conditions of work, the hours of work, and the expectation or requirement that children be in school. So the other thing that I have found myself repeatedly hoping to draw people's attention to is to thinking about the interplay and the relationship between access to universal public education in our history and in our policy history and regulation of child labor, because they've always been inextricably linked. And the debates that legislatures are having at the state level right now are unavoidably also wrapped up often in parallel debates that they are having about the future of their public education systems, the funding for those systems, how robust access will be, and whether parts of those systems are going to begin to be privatized. Right? So those things are unavoidably linked. So this question of how we will or whether we should regulate child labor has never been settled. I want to go back to the question you raised actually about who decides when and where a child can work, should work, and the question of whether that is entirely up to parents, partially up to parents, entirely up to, within some guidelines that are set by the state, is part of what has never been settled. So early in the 20th century, there are several attempts to begin setting some federal guidelines and regulations. The 1916 first law that is passed at the federal level gets challenged at the Supreme Court. And there is subsequently a fairly robust and popular push for a constitutional amendment, which is defeated by industry opposition. And I'm also reminding all of us, including myself, that about a decade ago, we had major politicians, including Newt Gingrich, taking aim at child labor regulation and saying we shouldn't have child labor laws at all, right? And as a corollary, that we shouldn't have a minimum wage, often as part of that argument. So the other pieces of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I want to highly recommend a book by Betsy Wood, historian, called Upon the Altar of Work, who walks through the long history of child labor regulation in the US, and also some of the arguments, both legal and moral, that parents, families, reformers, and also industry groups have used along the way. One of the points that she makes about the attempt to pass the constitutional amendment and the way in which that attempt was undermined, it seems particularly resonant and relevant right now in terms of our policy debates, because she points out that the arguments that industry groups began to mount that they found most effective were in fact appeals to quote unquote parental rights, and the question of whether voters would accept the state as the decision maker about, or the protector, versus leaving those decisions up to parents and family members. States, of course, are the first entity to begin requiring young people to attend school up until a certain age. So we, to this day, have, this is from 1933, but the patchwork began to evolve of very different standards around the country. We, to this day, have a fairly complicated patchwork of standards across the country in terms of state regulation, both on school attendance and also child labor. Again, these things going hand in hand. And so by the time we get to the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, we've got different states with different rules, and those different states with different rules are still kind of the underpinning, I would say, of the child labor regulatory system across the country today. So I raise this partly because I know, a lot of you are from different parts of the country. I think it's fascinating and important to think about what your own state's history or region that you might cover may be in terms of child labor, how it may differ from a different region of the country and why, and what kinds of industry dynamics and organized, in some cases influence, may have shaped that policy history at the state level and might be shaping it now today. So coming up to the present, 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which is still our primary framework for legal regulation of child labor. Fair Labor Standards Act sets the minimum wage, overtime, child labor rules for the first time. And the way to think about it is that it sets a floor. It sets a floor below which states cannot go, but states can improve upon the Fair Labor Standards Act. And in some cases, states already had better regulations in some regard. So we talked about the permitting system a minute ago that Arkansas just repealed. Those state permitting systems, if they were already in place or have been put in place, would be considered more protective than the Fair Labor Standards Act. Some states have stricter rules on hours than the Fair Labor Standards Act. So what we have, though, both in terms of minimum wage and child labor across the country today, is a very complex and sometimes confusing patchwork. Right? Folks know that minimum wage works the same way. The majority of states in the country at this point have raised their minimum wage above the federal floor of $7.25, and the same is true for child labor regulation. It's just a lot harder to put it in one map because there are so many different dimensions to the way child labor is regulated. We have a table in the report that's on our website, the EPI.org website, that tries to give at a glance a summary of the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act covering teen youth work, which I think is helpful to folks. It is taken directly from materials the Department of Labor issues, although I think ours is just easier to read. But the basics of the framework has been that age matters, right? Different ages are treated differently. As children get older, more occupations are open to them. The framework and the language in the Fair Labor Standards Act directs the Department of Labor to ensure that employers do not use oppressive child labor. And so a fair amount of the regulation has then been left up to the Department of Labor to determine which occupations are considered oppressive, how many hours are considered oppressive. So here's where we come back to, the Department of Labor being essentially in the situation we were when we looked at some of those scenarios at the top, right? The question of where do we put certain conditions on the spectrum of acceptable or not? And that those guidelines have shifted over time. The most recent time that, that's the table from our report, which I encourage you to read. It's too hard to read on the screen. But the most recent time that the hazardous occupation orders were updated by the Department of Labor was, I believe, in 2002. And they used a truly rigorous process of having National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health research and data inform recommendations to the Department of Labor about where were youth and at what ages most frequently being injured or falling ill, or worst case scenario, where were fatalities occurring? And how could that be prevented by adjusting the hazardous occupation orders to ensure that that stopped happening, right? So those regulations at the federal level represent a long history, a long set of experience, and especially in recent decades, really reflect significant research and data-driven analysis to try to protect youth from what would be considered, in 1938 language, oppressive forms of labor. So I raise this as well because some of what we're seeing at the state level this year and the last few years, I'll come back to this in a second, is directly taking aim at undermining some of those hazardous occupation orders. So the Iowa bill that I talked about earlier includes a long list of changes and exceptions that says the state, at least, will no longer recognize those hazardous occupation orders as prohibitive. Now, that sets up a really interesting conflict because federal law still applies. We said that already, right? The state can't diminish or go below. But what it does is it's the state very openly sending a message and saying, if employers cross that line, we certainly won't get involved and enforce that standard. It's entirely going to be up to the federal government to enforce its standard, which is the one employers are supposed to still follow. Okay, so I want to share a couple of data points that frankly are interesting, and I also have to say, I don't think most people are very interested in. But I'm sharing this partly because what I have found a lot of people in the public and also reporters to be interested in is what I guess we would call the labor shortage narrative that a lot of proponents of weakening child labor laws have used in their push to weaken standards. And in the report that we put out at EPI on child labor, one of my colleagues did a great job of thinking through what do the data about young workers tell us right now about whether this, whether the problem or whether there is some problem with not enough young people or not enough teens working, right? So the first chart here is just labor force participation among 16 to 24-year-olds. This goes back about 20 years. So you do see that one thing is clear. There are, over those 20 years, overall, fewer 16 to 24-year-olds participating in the labor force. And I don't know if anybody wants to hazard a guess as to why that might be. There is a way to answer this question with another data point. And Elise Gold, one of our other EPI economists, put this chart together recently, which goes back even further, about 30 years, and tracks the employment compared to enrollment in school. So there are fewer 16, 24-year-olds compared to 20 years ago in the labor force. It is all explained by more of them staying in school, as in completing high school, and or pursuing post-secondary education after high school. Now, for many, educators and youth advocates, that is a long-time goal that we've had, is to improve high school completion rates, increase the number of young people who are able to pursue post-secondary education. And so, depending on your perspective, this is either a huge success story, or it is also the case that we've seen industry lobbyists in state houses this year saying directly that they think the labor force participation rate is just too low among young people, and they want to see it higher. Okay? So I'm raising that these numbers do tell, can be used to tell very different stories, depending on what kind of outcome you're looking for. Most young people who are not in the labor force are in school. This is analysis of CPS, current population survey, responses that indicate that. The other thing that I find interesting in this one, and we talk about it in the report a little bit too, is that there are almost no young people who say that the reason they're not working right now is because they can't find work. So the other argument that I think we've seen crop up in state legislative debates repeatedly from industry groups who are trying to weaken child labor laws is their appeal to opening up opportunities, and somehow opening up opportunities that they claim are closed to young workers right now. The data just don't bear that out. There is almost no one in the 16 to 24-year-old category who's saying, I can't find work. And so I think another way in which the data can, give the lie to that particular argument that's been trotted out a few places. Lastly, this will be my last chart, I think. Young worker unemployment rate is at an historic low. This goes much further back, all the way to the 1950s. We have not seen unemployment rates for 16, 24-year-old categories this low literally in decades, right? So again, there don't particularly seem to be a lot of barriers to employment right now in our labor market for young people. And so rolling back child labor laws, if that is your argument for why you're doing it, clearly a solution that is not being motivated by a real problem. So who is behind the current push to weaken state child labor laws? I think, again, we've had excellent investigative journalism documenting some of the particularly ideological groups. One of them, the Foundation for Government Accountability, which also has a separate wing called the Opportunity Solutions group, is clearly coordinating much of the state legislative activity. So the post coverage of them, I think, is a good place to start, just to get a sense of how they operate, and also to see, they often register publicly in support of the bills they're lobbying for, and you can document that just by looking up who's registered on each bill. But I also, want to be clear that we know and can see from decades of the evolution of pushes to weaken child labor laws that this is an ongoing multi-industry campaign. So state legislation in Arkansas, Iowa, any of the states that we talk about in our report, oftentimes the state chapters of groups like the National Restaurant Association, certainly the National Federation of Independent Business, has been very outspoken about their position that child labor laws should be weakened. Construction industry groups are often in the mix. And again, they're often state and local chapters of these groups that are lobbying on behalf of changes. Different groups are often interested in different kinds of changes, which is the other interesting thing about how this often unfolds. The National Restaurant Association or its state chapters have often been particularly focused on extending the number of hours that teens can work later into the night. Changes, to go back to your example again, right, around at what age teens can begin busing or serving alcohol has been another one of their very clearly stated priorities. Construction industry groups, of course, have other interests. And so opening up construction work at different ages or access to work on construction sites for teens has been a clear priority for them as well. I should also say that there are clearly industry groups involved in the lobbying who are not public about their role or their influence. So, to go back to some of the coverage that New York Times and other outlets have done, and of course the very important Department of Labor investigation of the sanitation service company that was hiring on a widespread basis teens for overnight shifts to clean meatpacking plants, right? The meatpacking industry is heavily influential, both in Iowa and Arkansas, across several of the states that are moving to essentially legalize some of the practices that we know were already widespread from all those investigations. So the other thing that is fairly clear about the patterns that we're seeing in state legislation is that they mirror or parallel proposals that have been repeatedly brought forward in past administrations at the federal level. So if we go back to 1982, just as Reagan came into office, his Secretary of Labor at the time had a package of proposals that he brought forward that included opening up more occupations to 14 and 15-year-olds, extending the number of hours that could be worked during the school year, especially opening up occupations that had been classified as hazardous by the DOL in the past. So just even those three things are so clearly part of the priorities that are being brought forward in the state legislation that we're seeing crop up now. Off the shelf is a question here, but it's certainly, it's hard not to miss the parallel and that these are not brand new ideas that are being brought forward. They're long-term priorities for certain industry groups. And what we're seeing right now, of course, is rather than a federal level proposal, a state-by-state strategy to sort of chip away at standards where there are moments of opportunity. And the other thing that's clear from some of the public statements, and also I think one of the examples we cite in our report, is that as lawmakers in Ohio were bringing forward a proposal to extend hours in their state law, they also proposed a concurrent resolution calling on Congress to do the same thing. So being very clear about their hope that the state change would be met by a federal weakening of the Fair Labor Standards Act to match their state standard. So I want to wrap up by both asking you what would be helpful to you in your coverage as we think about additional research and potential data points that we can analyze going forward. And then also maybe making a couple tentative pitches on things that I have continued to think about as this story evolves. As I've watched some of the state debates continue to unfold, and it's very clear that this issue is not going away anytime soon. There's a lot left to cover, and I particularly have started to think about what are some of the things we haven't been talking about yet in a very public or robust way. So one thing, just in a nutshell, is I have continued to think and wonder, and I'm starting to think to see some signs that the silver lining of a really disturbing uptick in child labor violations and what is clearly a concerted effort to weaken standards is also that this time in our history, in 2023, that push is really being met with a lot of concern. Incredible journalism, as I mentioned. There's a spotlight on the problem of child labor that I think is stronger than at any time that I can remember in my lifetime. So it also presents a moment of opportunity, potentially, and maybe a silver lining, for us to open up a much broader dialogue about why is it that quote unquote oppressive forms of child labor truly never have been eradicated in parts of our economy. And particularly, of course, for poor youth, for migrant youth, for Black and brown youth. And to think about if we were going to move in a direction closer toward eradicating exploitative forms of child labor, what are the systemic problems that we have not solved? Some of those involve enforcement, right? So I think deeper dives into thinking about how does our current enforcement system work, and in many cases not work, both at the federal level and the state level. The two-tiered system for child labor in agriculture, and helping people understand what that means and how likely it is that almost every aspect of our food system is touched in some way by child labor still to this day. We cannot, as I think I said this at the beginning, we can't talk about child labor without talking about our immigration policy. And that's, in terms of easy policy fixes, that's the hardest one, but maybe also the most important for all of us to be focused on. Another thing that I actually think a lot of folks in the public have very little awareness of is the persistence of the phenomenon of sub-minimum wages. We've begun to have some policy change focused on eliminating tipped minimum wages in some states, disability sub-minimum wages in some states. We have barely begun to have a discussion publicly about this phenomenon of sub-minimum wages for youth and whether that's a policy we want to carry into the 21st century, right? So I think lots of room to begin thinking about what the impact of that is. And then just the whole category of, what do young workers want? What are young workers learning from their first, second, third jobs? And what do they have to tell us about the kind of future that we might want to pursue? The fissured workplace as a part of this story is key. And by the fissured workplace, I'm borrowing a term that David Weil has popularized. So I recommend his work to you as well. His book is literally called The Fissured Workplace. But this is the notion, the reality that many employees work for a staffing agency, a temp agency, a franchise of a larger corporation, right? So the layers and the way in which a primary employer may be 1 or 2 or 3 steps removed from a worker who's laboring for them. This has been, I think, covered in really excellent ways by a lot of journalists, and yet is still, I think, not something that most policymakers, especially at the state level, fully understand its implications. So, PSSI, the sanitation service that was hiring teens, was a contractor for JBS, Tyson, Smithfield, all of the major meatpacking companies. They're a major corporation owned by Blackstone, the largest private equity group in the world, incredibly profitable. But each one of those meatpacking companies that owns the facilities where the children were working, when the DOL began its investigation, all of them said, we had no idea that children were working in our facility. Now, that may or may not be true, but the remove from being the direct employer and the hiring of a contractor as the staffing agency allows employers often to distance themselves from that liability. Same is true in examples in the Hyundai-Kia supply chain throughout several facilities in Alabama, where there are secondary contractors or labor brokers recruiting teens to work. So hazardous work and the question of how injuries, death are compensated and whether employers are liable in instances where workers of any age are injured on the job is another area that I think is, it's quite complicated. It's, again, a state-by-state patchwork in our country. Each state has its own workers' compensation laws. And so, again, I think this is a huge area that is ripe for a lot of investigation and reporting that we've just barely begun to delve into. The question of the state role, right, and to go back to the change in Arkansas law on work permits, and this question going forward, I think that might be, I want to go to one more that I have here. Oh, okay. But the question of enforcement and this tension that is clearly going to be set up between states and the federal government is going to be, I actually have trouble predicting what will happen in particular instances. And so I think that makes it an important story to think about on a state and a regional level. The intersection, again, with immigration policy, and particularly the reality that if teens who are migrant youth, whose families are trapped in the asylum backlog, if they only had an expedited pathway to work authorization, their conditions could completely be transformed, right? So I know a couple of the children that Hannah Dreyer reported on have, most likely because of the attention drawn by her reporting, been able to gain work authorization, even since some of those stories came out. And so the follow-up stories on those are very valuable. But I think just the question of why do we not have a pathway to work authorization that would move people out of the limbo, out of the underground economy, and into situations where they could be working at a grocery store or a restaurant alongside their fellow students after school, rather than, being trapped in exploitative work. Stories of young workers and what they have to say about their work experiences and what they're looking for from the workplace and from their future careers, I think, are everywhere to be pursued right now. There's this really interesting case of Virginia where the state has raised its minimum wage above the federal level a couple of years ago. And there was a push this year in their state legislature to implement a youth sub-minimum to go below that new increase. And teens, went themselves to advocate at the State House and put a stop to it. We are seeing growing interest in organizing unions, especially the younger you go, the higher the response rate goes in terms of interest. This is from a 2018 survey, and I have to say, if they did the survey today, it would probably be even higher based on every anecdotal report we're seeing from folks. So, I think there's an incredible pent-up interest in improving working experiences among young people in particular. Some folks may know and be aware that one important federal policy change or breakthrough that has happened under the Biden administration is the implementation of a program to offer deferred action to workers who are bringing forth violations of a labor or employment law, or who are facing retaliation because they are organizing. And I raise this because I think it is still a fairly little known new option that can potentially be used to help protect workers that don't have work authorization, including young workers, right? And so, having had a lot of conversations with reporters over the last few months, in some cases, I will say 98% of the conversations have been lovely. And then once or twice, I've had somebody call and say, I just really need to talk to somebody who's working illegally. Most people who know they're working illegally aren't probably going to want to talk to you. But I'm raising this because I actually think that another really important public service that journalists can help perform is letting more people know about this new policy option and connecting, or immigrant advocates and workers' rights advocates around the country are working on connecting this information to workers who are organizing and investigating violations in their workplaces. But I don't think it's a widely known among the public. So the other just huge category of stories to be told are the ways in which those occupational carve-outs, the racism of our past and present, are continuing to shape our entire labor and employment landscape, right? And we are seeing that in the ways in which Black and brown youth tend to be more exploited, and the way in which migrant youth are being exploited. So, I think, again, looking at this on a state level is particularly fascinating because the policy history is different in each state. The policy debate that's happening right now is unique in every state. And that unevenness and that patchwork is only possible partly because we have such a weak floor at the federal level. We've got those basic guardrails, and then so much is left up to states, and particularly, of course, the agricultural exemption. Another huge set of stories that I would love to see more attention on is, what's the alternative to exploitative first jobs? Well, there are lots of alternatives and a lot of positive alternatives. And often in some states, those positive alternatives have faced a lot of defunding. So that's another aspect of the story. I mentioned this already, so I think I don't need to reiterate this part, but the reality that states where the Foundation for Government Accountability particularly has prioritized trying to roll back child labor has tended to be the same states where they are advocating for a set of policies that limit access to Medicaid for poor families and also implement new means testing or work requirements to access SNAP and other benefits. So it's a very disturbing, sort of package of policies that both increase potentially the economic desperation of families with children at the same time that child labor laws are being relaxed. And I think bringing more attention to the relationship between those policies as well as what's happening to public education is a really ripe area for more coverage. So I will happily take any thoughts or questions or requests that you all have of us as well. And my contact information is there for anybody who's interested in following up.
Join me.
Yeah.
So I think this is yet another example of a speaker who really took my imperative to heart when we talked. Those last few slides were just a gold mine of story ideas. My first question to you was going to be, is it realistic that the fellows could go back to their hometowns and hit the ground running in terms of exploring what the possibilities are? And so the slide alone with the connection between a state that's cutting back Medicaid and those sorts of programs and the child labor link is to me fascinating. So my first question to you before I open it up is, obviously a New York Times and a Washington Post and LA Times has the resources to spend months doing this, to dig deep, et cetera. So what advice would you give someone who is at a paper that's laying people off and, just totally deprioritizing this type of coverage? How can they sort of be creative about this?
So, I think a couple basic things that I am curious about and that I will say we haven't even had time to do at EPI would be looking at what state enforcement records show. Department of Labor publicizes their enforcement. So, it's as easy as going to their website to see, okay, how many violations did they record last year? Now, some states, depending on the agency and depending on administrative decisions usually that agency has made, may do that as well, but some don't. And so in some cases, it takes maybe a FOIA request to see what they would send back. But I think those are questions that, without a reporter delving into it a little bit, we often don't know what the state agencies are doing to enforce child labor. And I think actually a really good model for thinking about how to delve into that a little bit is there has been, over the last decade at least, some pretty significant attention to the problem of wage theft. Often it's the same state agencies that are responsible for enforcing the wage payment laws in a state that are also charged with child labor, right? So there may be even some patterns from past investigations or reporting, or in some cases our own groups have taken a look at wage theft, but they haven't taken a look at child labor. And the new state policy debates, of course, are really making me curious if we would begin to look more systematically at what the landscape of state enforcement is across the country, what would we find?
Has anyone in this room not filed a FOIA request? I would encourage you to think about this as sort of the entry point into that process and into this story, because increasingly, to get the information we need to do these kinds of stories, we're just going to have to, everybody's going to have to know how to do it. Questions?
Hi, my name is Rachel Cohen. I write for Vox. I actually did a explainer last week on these bills, and
That was a fantastic piece, by the
Oh,
way.
thank
Thank
you.
you so much. I love it. Yeah.
I was
So
going to
good.
say, I mentioned EPI's report on the education. I guess I thought I'd just wanted to mention a couple other things that I feel like is helpful. One is that we don't have good data on the number of child workers. That we don't keep the American Community Survey only asks about employment for those over 16 and older. So most of the estimates are trying to cobble together from very incomplete school sets and others, which is why especially migrant youth, but really all child labor, we just don't have a very good picture of it. I think I did speak with one wage hour investigator who was who felt like the proposed changes are not going to be very impactful on a practical level, and he pointed out even if minors are approved to work in hazarded jobs, most firms won't allow it because their insurance won't provide liability coverage, which is why construction apprenticeships don't permit entry of minors, even though federal government allows this. So I think those I think that's a sort of a thing to watch of what are some of the practical things of how these laws might work in effect. He also mentioned even if they get rid of the state requirement for parent permission, schools might still require it for attendance purposes for work study. So that was one thing. And I guess the other thing I was thinking about is just this we were talking about how details matter, and I think there's a lot of there's child labor, there's youth employment, there's teen jobs, there's different language in this conversation, and they all kind of hit people differently. And so there's parents feel really positively about teen work and teen jobs. If you poll them, they really and so to some extent I think some of the actors that are interested in these bills definitely know that they're trying to sort of leverage those things. I think the overlap with migrant youth and sort of a lot of the risk for the really vulnerable populations, it can be challenging to sort of piece that out when it's next to a bill that's should 16-year-olds be allowed to work 50 hours in the summer versus 40 hours? Right. That doesn't sound, so some of these bills, a lot of people would say, oh, it's okay if a teen works till 9 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. Right. Parents should get to decide that. And so I think this story is, I think this presentation was great, and I also just think as I was researching it, there's so much, to be aware that people are going to be maybe, I don't know if that's so bad. Is that exploitative? And then trying to figure out, what are the immediate risks and what's, the fears of slippery slopes and, loosening, I think, because that's kind of, it's a little difficult to prove that things will lead to X, Y, Z, and but those are concerns. And so I found that when I was writing about it, is the fear of this happening? How do we assess that? And I don't know if you have more thoughts on that question, but those were just extra.
Yes, I do have thoughts on that question. And that's exactly right. That I have found myself using this phrase that I think the Child Labor Coalition sometimes uses as well, but safe age appropriate work. But it also sounds so paternalistic that I have not always loved that phrase even. But, the language is so challenging because youth employment sounds positive. I think that's right. Until you get into the details about what does it mean, how many hours, what's the impact, how is it affecting someone's education, right? So I think all of that is worth thinking about. And frankly, I do think the other reality, having delved back into, I hadn't looked at some of this in a long time until recently, but delving back into some of the history, we frankly have inherited, some late 19th, early 20th century language for talking about the work of children that is probably not relevant anymore, and we don't have good replacements yet for it. The other thing I didn't talk about, though, that I think probably does deserve a lot more attention is the clear and pretty consistent research on the impact of excessive hours on development and education outcomes. that is probably yet another pitch that, there are, studies that our Child Labor Coalition friends have pointed us to, just, kind of reminding that once 20 hours is considered a sort of outer bound for work during the school year, because again and again, what researchers will find is if you get beyond that 20 hours a week during the school year, you start to see impact, and you start to see movement into a higher risk category for not finishing a grade level or not finishing high school. And then for us at EPI, I think another important, maybe even more important part of that impact is looking at the reality that the not finishing high school is the biggest indicator of your lifetime earnings, right? There's a just unbelievable economic impact for an individual or a family. There's the economic benefit on the one hand of income at a young age from a job, but there's also potentially really significant long-term economic harm of long hours of low-wage work at a young age that is not setting up young people for career success. So that's hard to explain in a soundbite, but it is a huge part of the slippery slope problem, right? Which, we talk about safety, it's the same problem. We want young people to be challenged, to begin experiencing what it's like to be in social settings, in some kind of formal environment, work expectations, discipline, all of the positives that we associate with early work experiences. But where is the line, right? Where's the line which it begins to cross over into potential harm? Another thing I didn't talk about at all, but that I have definitely seen crop up and probably deserves a lot more attention, is the reality of workplaces for people of all ages are potentially abusive. And the experience that, the reality that we know that particularly many young women, first jobs are learning about how to navigate harassment or sexual harassment. And that is something that, we're not, I think, focusing on very squarely in this debate right now, which has struck me because, we are in a moment where Me Too has opened up a very different public discourse about that for working women. But I haven't yet really seen it intersecting with the dialogue about youth work and teens yet. So, Rachel, to your point, I think that's another way in which, just the fundamental question of what do we hope young people learn about life and work from their first jobs? And, it doesn't mean it should be necessarily all easy or challenging, but are we hoping that they learn, we're hoping that, I think in most cases, that they don't have to learn how to navigate abuse and toxic environments, and but that's all too typical.
Jackie.
Jackie with South Dakota Public Broadcasting. I will be talking to you more about ag labor, but I also wonder if you can speak to the tourism industry, that seasonal labor, and kind of the overlap you see with youth labor there, but also that visa and temporary work visa situation, if there's any correlation that you're seeing with some of the state legislation.
So that is a great question. I want to say I have a colleague, Daniel Costa at EPI, who is a total expert on every one of the visa programs. And so I recommend maybe following up with him on that specifically. Yes, there's total overlap. However, I've not seen it raised specifically in any of the state legislative debates. And I think, largely because those visa programs are federal. It does not appear that, those industries are definitely interested in longer hours. But in terms of their access to, visa workers, they don't see the state as the avenue, I guess, too. But yeah, there probably is a clear overlap if we were to look for it in terms of their advocacy for expanding numbers of visas, what the lobbying they're doing at the federal level, and maybe what they're looking for in terms of extended hours on the state. That would be interesting to try to track.
Eli.
Hey there. My name is Eli. I'm a freelance investigative journalist. My question is just sort of curious to pick your mind. It seems to me this was like such a wonky, boring issue for so many people for so long until Hannah went out and like sat outside factories at midnight and then told the story the way she did, and now it's like pushing bills forward. And I wonder kind of what you learned from kind of that recent experience and prior experience, seeing how people cover it, that have informed the ways you think about effective storytelling on issues that on paper can seem very wonky.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say one thing that comes to mind immediately also is that both historically and now, the combination of storytelling and photography has almost always been, one of the primary movers of policy change on child labor. That is very clear historically. And I think there was a Washington Post editorial just a couple days ago from a photographer who's been for years, documenting child labor in agriculture, reflecting on what's the role of journalists and photographers right now in this policy moment too. So, I have to say, I think also the reality is that we were not seeing, at least in mainstream press, significant storytelling on this issue over the last decade. Looking back at some of the kind of little blip of attention to child labor a decade ago when Gingrich boldly said we should roll back standards, it was honestly treated as sort of a joke at the time. And I think he said something about janitors and the kids could take over cleaning the school and it would be cheaper than hiring union employees, right? So it really sort of amounted to that. I'm curious I'm actually would be really curious to hear from all of you if you've seen what you think strike you as especially effective storytelling, in addition to Hannah's pieces, which clearly, again, having the resources to spend months getting to know children and families and following them and being able to give three-dimensional accounts of their circumstances and what they were experiencing. There's just nothing more compelling than that. That's more difficult when you don't have those kinds of resources. I don't think I'm giving a great answer to your question. But
can I perhaps suggest that the possibility of, again, going back to your home states, asking for records, there's a slight chance that we'll come across a story like there were 10,000 abuses in our state, because I think a perception a lot of people have is that it's only agriculture and it doesn't happen that much or enough to be a problem in my state. So I just wonder if, again, without having the resources to do deep dives and spend a lot of time, just getting some of the basic nuts and bolts is a way.
I also think that even, it's also the case that in a lot of states, I would hazard a guess that digging into state agency enforcement data is going to turn up that there aren't many recorded violations at all. I expect it's going to vary a lot because state resources are often so limited for carrying out those enforcement activities. But another thing that strikes me is that the reality too is that whether somebody's been in what they might consider an exploitative situation or not, people just simply love talking about their work experiences. And I wonder what would come from additional, more extended delving into, you could pick an industry and it could be fast food, or it could be retail, or it could be, thinking about the places where it could be tourism, right? And it could be, workers who are here on visas for the summer in national parks, or whatever the situation may be. But getting at both the often positive and negative valence of what people are experiencing and what's compelled them to pursue the work that they're doing, I think is something it's kind of like right there in front of us,
Right.
but, and not, doesn't require lots of FOIAs and digging, but we might be missing sometimes. Right?
We could keep you here all evening, so I'm just going to ask, are there any final questions? Bonnie? Oh, okay, Jen. Okay, well, these will be our last questions.
I'm Jen Christensen. I work at CNN in the medical unit. I studied Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor under FDR, who this was her big mission. But one of the things that she was so successful in teaching FDR about this, and they got this kind of legislation through, was she literally walked him through, I'm sure you know, the factories to see the children in these deplorable conditions. Are there, well, it also helped that they had a supermajority of Democrats, so they could pass things like this. But are there groups that are taking the policymakers through, in addition to the journalists, and showing them? And are companies or whoever's employing these children, are they embarrassed enough that they hide this? Like, how does this work?
So it's interesting that you asked that. So one of the really, truly unbelievable events in the course of this debate in my state of Iowa over, the most extreme piece of child labor legislation that's been proposed in decades. Like the week when the Senate was planning to vote on it in April, the Carpenters Union took some local and state elected officials on a tour of a construction site and found a 13 or 14-year-old working in the middle of the day. And yes, the contractor definitely tried to deny and hide it. It generated some significant both concern and media coverage in the state. It obviously did not derail the passage of that bill. But now how routinely is that? And of course, this tour was not arranged with the expectation that child labor would be uncovered. There were some concerns about safety hazards on the job site, and that was really intended to be the focus, but they turned up this as well. I think it speaks to, it's also a unique situation where the union had access and a way to get people into that workplace, which is not so easy with most private businesses, unless there's a connection or unless there's an agency that's got authorization to inspect for some reason. So more of that would definitely be welcome. There may be a role for journalists to think about, how to pursue access or where there are points of access more often. And again, to go back to the agriculture point, we definitely do have, a lot of documentation and visualization of what those conditions are like. And so continuing to draw attention in a broader way, I think is a definite priority.
Who was next?
Hi, I'm Maddie Alexander. I work for Politico. When you're talking about enforcement, the one thing that I'm thinking about, I'm a data journalist, is like the data behind that you'll see, like, child labor violations at the federal level. At the state level, that's kind of harder to find the data for it. But I'm wondering, like, have you guys collected data on budgets or funding for enforcement state by state, or like the number of staff that's dedicated to any of this? Like, is there some measure of enforcement is going down on a national scale because the states individually lack the resources? I don't know if that data exists somewhere, or like if you've done that kind of like surveying state to state of how that's affecting the enforcement.
Yeah. So there is pretty close monitoring of that on the federal level, right? That we know the understaffing and the underfunding is a significant problem. On the state level, it has been done for wage and hour wage payment. And again, because a lot of times those same agencies include child labor enforcement, I think it's a pretty good proxy. But I will also say that comprehensive scan or assessment has not been done for a few years. I mean, it's a big undertaking. So, you know, it may be, if we could find capacity for it, I would love for EPI to do it. But that's, I would say that's the closest we have, is some of the reporting or the reports on wage theft from a few years ago did try to go down to the state level and find out from each agency, how many investigators do you have, how many full-time staff, what's the funding for your agency, and then how does it compare proportionally to the workforce in your state in terms of coverage.
Was that it? Once again, I have to say, I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to come and really give us some top-level insights and tips on how to cover this issue. And I can promise you that the journalists in this room will follow up with you and will count on you for advice and support. So let's take this opportunity to show Jen our appreciation.
Well, the appreciation is mutual, and really enjoyed spending some time with you and hearing a little bit about you, and look forward to seeing all your forthcoming coverage.
And that concludes day 3 of the Future of the American Child Journalism Training. We're looking forward to a great conclusion tomorrow. So thank you all for being here, and see you tomorrow.